Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Insightful Thinkers podcast. Today on the menu is cannabis, the ancient history, and really just the ancient origins. This is going to be a little bit of a shorter episode. It's not going to be a comprehensive history of cannabis use from the very start, but I really became curious about where and when cannabis use originated. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And it turns out it's been used for quite a while. First of all, let's do a little background about cannabis, first of all, and just the effects of it, just to really talk about what it is before we dive into the history of it. The main effects of cannabis are pleasurable feelings of elation and well-being, and a loss of inhibition and an altered sense of time. People also reporting feeling an increase in imagination, but levels of concentration are known to be reduced at the same time. Behavior may become compulsive, but it has very rarely been found to be violent or aggressive in any way. Touch, taste, smell, and hearing are augmented, so all of your senses are kind of heightened. Everything kind of is experienced a little bit more profoundly, it seems. And this includes music and art. And a lot of people report an enhanced appreciation of music and art. So what it really does is it doesn't really add too much to your senses. It doesn't really cause you to hallucinate too much. What it really does is just enhance what already exists and the perception of that. And this leads you to kind of a heightened awareness of stimuli which were previously latent that you may not have considered. So when you're listening to a song, maybe a lyric, you understand it now, or a movie, you understand this sequence, or the acting is more special to you now, or things are really heightened, and things that were kind of long ignored can almost be seen anew in a way. Let's talk about the history now. Just a brief kind of episode, as I mentioned, on really where the cannabis use originated. It hasn't always been used for the psychoactive effects, which are more well known. It's also been used in a lot of different things, and we're going to talk about that today. So where cannabis originated, the plant itself, prior to being domesticated by humans, is unknown. Plant domestication, by the way, is the process whereby wild plants are evolved into crop plants through selective breeding. So you can think of this kind of as the way humans bred dogs, and you breed the dogs for certain traits that you want. You breed a mountain dog for one thing and a retriever for another. Plants can go through the same domestication process, and that's what happened with cannabis. But before this domestication, it's not exactly clear where cannabis originated naturally. Most studies imply that cannabis evolved naturally in the temperate zones of Central Asia, perhaps. The picture really is confused by the fact that cannabis was one of the first plants to be cultivated, and present-day areas of wild growth may have resulted from plants escaping from prehistoric cultivation in the first place. So even the strains we find today may not have been the actual wild strains from the natural origin. They just may be strains that came from the domestication that humans did to it. So it's difficult to put a starting point really on the natural origin of cannabis, but it seems to have evolved somewhere in Central Asia quite a while ago. What we do have greater knowledge of is when humans actually began to use the plant, because we can really trace that back through archaeological evidence and through texts. So cannabis, as mentioned, it may have been one of the first plants to be farmed or at least utilized. At what stage the psychoactive properties of cannabis were discovered is unknown still, but this could have been discovered very early on in its agricultural development. For instance, the resin could have easily been accidentally or even purposely eaten. So all this to say that once we started cultivating and domesticating the cannabis plant, we may have used it for other things, like we're going to talk about, like rope and cloth and things like this, and decoration. But while in those early days, we might have also discovered the psychoactive properties that I mentioned at the start of the episode, like the enhanced perceptions of all sorts of things. So let's take it back to Europe. This is where the origin really may have been. A group known as the Proto-Indo-Europeans, who occupied what is now Romania 5,000 years ago, so around 3000 BC, used cannabis as incenses. There were cannabis resins found at a gravesite in this, what is now Romania. A smoking cup was also discovered at the same site, which contained remnants of charred hemp seeds. So from the remnants of the charred hemp seeds, it can be determined that the combustible and psychoactive parts of the plant, namely the flowers and leaves, had been consumed, and the hard shell-like residue of the seeds were left behind. So this kind of indicates that we may have been using cannabis for its psychoactive properties since the very origins of use, close to 5,000 years ago in 3000 BCE. Even older ceramic tripod bowls have also been discovered, believed to have been ancient incense burners for cannabis as well. So there's a little bit of evidence in Europe for ancient use, but where most of the evidence really comes from is from China, and China's agricultural processes that cultivated the cannabis plant or the hemp plant. So hemp was one of the earliest crop plants in China. The archaeological record shows that China was the earliest region to cultivate and use hemp. So whereas we saw that in ancient Romania it was used, China was really where it started to be cultivated and domesticated, kind of in a conscious effort through many, many generations. Hemp, by the way, is the variety of the cannabis plant that is cultivated that contains small amounts of THC and is more grown for other uses such as string, rope, and cloth. This is what the Chinese were originally using it for, and using the hemp or the cannabis plant for. So according to the Chinese historic records and archaeological data, the history of Chinese hemp cultivation and use spans approximately 5,000 to 6,000 years. So it started really as early as 4,000 BC in China and really continued ever since that. The oldest Chinese treatise on agriculture, the Jie Jiaojiang, written around 1600 BC, named hemp as a main crop. And also in the Book of Songs and the Annals, written during the Warring States period, so 475 to 221 BC, mention is made of the 6 crops that are commonly planted in China, and cannabis is one of these. So it was really one of the most common plants that was planted and cultivated in ancient China. Several other ancient Chinese texts mention hemp farming, and they really go into detail about aspects of cultivation such as plowing and sowing depths that are needed, ideal planting times, fertilization times, irrigation, pest control, harvesting times, and fiber quality control through selective eradication of seedlings and fiber extraction techniques. So after a while, they had developed an entire kind of manual on how to properly cultivate the cannabis plant in ancient China. So they were really the pioneers of initiating this domestication of the cannabis plant, it seems. They also used it for medicine too. So the earliest reference to the use of cannabis as medicine is believed to have been made sometime around 2500 BCE. So a little bit after they had already been cultivating it for string, rope, and cloth and things like this. So cannabis is mentioned in the medical compendium of the legendary Chinese emperor Shen Nung. Shen Nung is known as the father of Chinese medicine, and he determined that the female plant contained the most potent medicine and prescribed chuma. So chuma is female hemp as opposed to ma, which is just hemp that is lower THC, for the treatment of absent-mindedness, constipation, malaria, rheumatism, and menstrual problems. So Shen Nung was the first to really determine that, okay, the cannabis sativa plant, the female version of it, the version that contains more THC and more compounds that are readily absorbed by the brain and can allow us to experience psychoactive effects, is going to be used in the medicine, and the male hemp plant should be more used for like the string and the rope and the other uses. So this Chinese emperor was the first to kind of lay down the manual for how to use the female version of the plant, which, as I mentioned, has more of these psychoactive compounds, and he used it in medicine. Shen Nung was so thoroughly impressed with the beneficial effects of chuma, again, the female version of the hemp plant with the psychoactive compounds, that he deemed it one of the superior elixirs of immortality. So this cannabis really impressed Shen Nung for medical uses. And throughout the centuries, the Chinese continued to use it as medicine, and physicians continued to prescribe cannabis as they became more familiar with the effects of the plant. And new discoveries were continually being made about its properties. One of these discoveries was made in 200 CE, so quite a bit after these initial writings by Shen Nung. This discovery was made by the well-known Chinese surgeon Hua To. Almost 2,000 years ago, he is reputed to have performed painless surgical operations using an anesthetic prepared from cannabis resin and wine known as mayo. So these doctors had started to use this kind of as an anesthetic, and the Chinese have been using cannabis for this for years. In terms of the psychoactive effects specifically, the earliest references to the psychoactive and psychological effects of cannabis appear in the Materia Medica Sutra, or Pen Sao, also attributed to Shen Nung around 2500 BCE. So right as Shen Nung was kind of indicating all the medical uses for cannabis, he was also denoting the psychoactive effects of it. So in the Materia Medica Sutra, it says, Ma Fen, which is the cannabis seed, if taken in excess, will produce hallucinations. If taken over a long term, it makes one communicate with spirits and lightens one's body. So they had already discovered these kind of psychoactive effects of cannabis along with their medical uses and with their kind of more industrial uses of the male hemp plant. Along with Europe and along with China, there is also some really ancient evidence of cannabis use in ancient Egypt. So we have evidence of the use of, again, the hemp plant in some texts. So a passage written on stone from the pyramid texts at the end of the 5th dynasty, dated to around 2350 BCE, so still in very ancient times, around when the Chinese were discovering the hemp plant, says this: "The king is identified with the sun god. The king has tied the cords of the plant." And the word in this Egyptian text that is used to refer to plant is spoken of as something from which ropes are made. So this implies that it could have been hemp that they're talking about here. Also in the Egyptian papyrus Remisium III, around 1700 BCE, a little more recently, but still relatively ancient, it says, "A treatment for the eyes. Hemp is ground and left in the dew overnight. Both eyes of the patient are to be washed with it early in the morning." So here's another use that they had discovered for hemp in the kind of in the medical area. And it kind of parallels what we still use it for today in the treatment of glaucoma, or possibly kind of as we use it as for its anti-inflammatory effects. That's an effect that I didn't mention in the start of the episode because I was really just talking about the subjective cognitive effects of it, but it does tend to reduce inflammation. And this is why it is thought to be used in treating glaucoma, because you need to reduce the swelling in the optic nerve and just throughout the body in general. So along with these texts that show us evidence that it was used in ancient Egypt, we also have physical evidence too on top of that. So hemp fibers were found in the tomb of the pharaoh Amenephis IV, who lived around 1350 BCE, and several cannabis pollen grains were also found inside the mummy of Ramesses II, who died around 1213 BC. The last place that we have ancient evidence of cannabis use is in Taiwan. So shards of clay of the Tepen culture dating back to between 10,000 and 3,000 BC. So it's quite a long range, but again, this, even if it were found anywhere in this range, this would show that it was being used possibly even before the Chinese were using it in about 3,000 BC. So these shards of clay in Taiwan were found to have indentations of hemp cord. Excavations of sites dating back to as far as 5000 BCE as well indicate that cloth and netting were made with hemp fibers in ancient, what is now Taiwan. So really what we're seeing is that cannabis has been used, the plant has been used for thousands and thousands of years, and it doesn't seem like it started in specifically one place, but it does seem that the Chinese were the ones who really started to cultivate it and to really parse out all the different uses for it in their texts and all these different things. So the Chinese were probably the most responsible for the evolution of the plant and its uses, but it had been used in different cultures for thousands of years. So yeah, in conclusion, at least 5,000 years ago, it seems, people were already using cannabis for a variety of things, perhaps even including the widely noted psychological effects that Shen Nung pointed out, where it drives you to hallucinations and things like this. Although it doesn't actually do that, but in the translation, it says hallucinations. I believe the way Shen Nung put it, it should have translated to something like devils are seen or something like that. But either way, these psychological effects were determined very early on in the cultivation of the plant. And over time, as more and more uses were discovered by the Chinese and by other cultures, which added to the benefits of cannabis cultivation and made societies want to cultivate cannabis, the plants were farmed more, and then the seeds spread more, and they were spread really across the world. And that continues to this day. And that's why every country in the world has some kind of use for it to some extent, pretty much. So really many ancient civilizations did use it, including the ancient Greeks and in ancient times in India as well. It's been used in a drink called Bhang, I believe it's spelled Bhang, and really the history just continues after kind of those early discoveries in China. It just spread across the world. But as I mentioned, this is not an episode that's going to trace that entire history. I think it would be a little bit dubious to try to fit that all into one episode. But for further reading, if you do want to follow it from these origins that I've just pointed out all the way up until now, a great book for that I used in the creation of this episode, or one of the books I used, is Martin Booth, Cannabis, A History, 2003. So go check that book out if you really want more of an exhaustive history, starting with the origins and getting up until now. But we're going to stop here today. And I just was very curious about the origins. Where did this plant come from, and all of these people and cultures and societies that rave about it? Where did it start? And it was very interesting to find how early the use of cannabis started. Thank you for listening to this episode, everybody. We're growing our community through word of mouth. So if you liked this episode, please let one or two of your friends know about it. If you think they would also enjoy it, or if you enjoy in-depth analysis, just please share that with a couple of people. Please subscribe as well, or follow on whatever platform you listen or watch on. Leave a star rating or a review on Apple Podcasts, or a like on YouTube. You can also share your ideas in the YouTube comments section, or from the Connect page on the website, insightfulthinkersmedia.com, through Instagram at insightfulthinkersmedia, or Twitter at teamITM. You can check out the poems and the articles on the website. And if you want to join our monthly ITP video conference call, where we choose topics to analyze together every month, you can support the podcast on Patreon. Whatever you guys do to support, listening and watching is always plenty. Thank you guys for listening in. I found this one very interesting. Just really the ancient origins of cannabis use. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. So thank you, everyone, for tuning into the Insightful Thinkers podcast. We'll be back next Monday, as always, for more in-depth analysis into a diverse set of topics. Take care, everybody.